In the early hours of November, under a thin veil of mountain mist, 600 Spanish soldiers stand on the edge of an empire that should crush them instantly. Across the valley lies Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any in Europe, defended by millions of Aztecs, fed by endless tribute, hardened by generations of ritual warfare. The Spaniards are sick. They are exhausted. They are deep inside hostile territory, with no safe retreat. Their commander, Hernán Cortés, is not leading an army. He is leading a gamble. He has burned his own ships, cut off escape, and tied survival to a single outcome: victory or annihilation. Facing him is Moctezuma II, ruler of an empire that stretches across mountains, valleys, and lakes, an emperor whose word commands tens of thousands of warriors to move at once. By every law of mathematics, this should be a massacre. By every rule of warfare, these men should not last a day. And yet, within months, the Aztec Empire will collapse, not because of superior numbers, not because of better weapons alone, but because of one catastrophic error that turns power into paralysis and hesitation into surrender. This is the story of how 600 Spaniards defeated 15 million Aztecs, and why the greatest empires often fall not to strength, but to a single fatal decision. Before steel met obsidian, before gunpowder echoed across the lakes of central Mexico, the imbalance of power was already staggering. In numerical terms, the Aztec world should have swallowed the Spaniards whole. The empire ruled by Moctezuma II was not a loose tribal confederation. It was a centralized, tribute-driven system controlling millions of people, capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of professional warriors on short notice. Its cities were immense. Its logistics were refined. Its political authority was absolute. Opposing this stood fewer than 600 Spaniards, led by Hernán Cortés, a minor noble with no royal army, no reinforcements, and no legal authority to even be there. Many of his men were not soldiers by profession. Some were debtors, adventurers, or second sons seeking fortune. Most were already weakened by tropical disease and hunger. The ratio was not 10 to 1. It was not 100 to 1. It was thousands to 1. And yet, this imbalance hid a deeper tension, because the Aztecs and the Spaniards were not fighting the same kind of war. Aztec warfare was designed around ritual, dominance, and psychological submission. Battles were often fought to capture enemies alive, not annihilate them. Victory meant forcing submission, extracting tribute, and reinforcing cosmic order. Total extermination was rare and often counterproductive. Spanish warfare, by contrast, was shaped by centuries of brutal European conflict. It was about decisive destruction, breaking command structures, killing leaders, and collapsing morale in a single blow. Cortés did not need to defeat the Aztec Empire in the field. He needed to fracture it from the inside. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The Spaniards should never have reached the heart of the empire in the first place. From the moment Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast, he was surrounded by enemies. The coastal peoples feared Aztec retaliation. Inland city-states despised Aztec tribute demands but feared rebellion. Every step inland increased the risk of ambush, starvation, or encirclement. Several of Cortés' own officers urged retreat. One veteran captain reportedly warned that entering Tenochtitlan would be suicide, a trap with no exit. Cortés did something unprecedented. He burned his ships. There would be no return to the coast, no escape route, no fallback position. The only way out now was forward into the center of the most powerful empire in the Americas. This decision changed the psychology of everyone involved. For the Spaniards, retreat was no longer an option. Fear turned into fatalism. Fatalism hardened into resolve. For the Aztecs, however, the decision created confusion. Why would an invading force deliberately trap itself? Why would enemies walk uninvited into the heart of imperial power? Moctezuma II did not respond with immediate annihilation. Instead, he hesitated. Part of that hesitation came from politics. Killing the Spaniards outright risked rebellion among subject peoples who saw them as potential liberators. Part of it came from intelligence failures, overestimating Spanish numbers and underestimating their intentions. and part of it came from belief. The Aztec worldview did not separate war from cosmology. Omens mattered, timing mattered, interpretation mattered, and the arrival of foreign men, animals never seen before, weapons that thundered and killed at a distance. These events did not fit existing categories. So Moctezuma chose caution. He sent gifts. He sent envoys. He allowed the Spaniards to advance. In military terms, this was not mercy. It was delay. And delay, in warfare, is often the most expensive mistake of all. By the time the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan, they were not conquerors. They were guests, surrounded, watched, vastly outnumbered, but alive. The Aztec Empire still held overwhelming strength, but it had surrendered initiative, and once initiative is lost, even empires begin to bleed. From the outside, the Aztec Empire looked invincible. At its center stood Moctezuma II, a ruler whose authority was absolute in theory and terrifying in practice. He was not merely a king. He was the living axis between gods and men, responsible for maintaining cosmic balance through tribute, warfare, and ritual. By the time the Spaniards approached Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma was an experienced ruler. He had overseen expansion, crushed revolts, and ruled an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. His armies were not disorganized mobs. They were structured forces with ranks, veteran officers, and elite warrior societies like the Eagle and Jaguar warriors, men trained from youth for combat and capture. On paper, the Aztecs possessed every advantage. They could field tens of thousands of warriors within days. Their supply system fed armies through tribute and causeways. Their capital city sat in the middle of a lake, connected by narrow roads that could be cut at will. Any enemy entering it could be isolated, starved, and annihilated. And yet, this machine had a flaw. The Aztec military was optimized for control, not annihilation. Victories were measured by submission, not destruction. Capturing enemy leaders alive brought prestige and political leverage. Ritual sacrifice reinforced order and intimidated rivals. Total slaughter, especially of high-status enemies, disrupted tribute networks and invited instability. The Spaniards did not understand this system at first, but they benefited from it immediately. When Cortés' force reached the outer approaches of the empire, Aztec commanders did not attack en masse. They observed, they tested, they skirmished. This was normal procedure, probing an enemy's strength before committing. But Cortés interpreted this caution as weakness. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Aztec commanders were not failing to act. They were waiting for authorization. Every major decision flowed upward to Moctezuma. Independent initiative was limited. The system functioned perfectly when the emperor's will was clear. It slowed dramatically when uncertainty crept in. And Moctezuma was uncertain. Reports flooded in describing men who rode beasts taller than warriors, whose weapons shattered shields and killed instantly, whose armor could not be cut by obsidian blades. These reports were exaggerated, but exaggeration thrives in hierarchical systems where messengers fear being wrong. Moctezuma responded with gifts, not armies. Gold, fine textiles, food, symbolic gestures meant to assert dominance through generosity. To the Aztec worldview, this was strength. To the Spaniards, it was confirmation of opportunity. Cortés immediately grasped something crucial. The empire's power depended on psychological authority. If that authority wavered, the machine would stall. He began to exploit this hesitation deliberately. The Spaniards marched slowly, deliberately, never rushing, never appearing afraid. They accepted gifts as tribute, not diplomacy. They spread rumors, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through interpreters, that their leader answered to a distant, all-powerful king. This was not military conquest yet. It was narrative warfare. By the time the Spaniards reached the gates of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma faced an impossible dilemma. If he attacked and failed, the emperor would appear weak. If he attacked and succeeded, he risked rebellion among subject peoples already watching closely. If he allowed the Spaniards inside, he could observe, contain, and perhaps neutralize them. He chose containment. The enemy machine, vast, disciplined, terrifying, did not strike. It paused. Inside that pause, Cortés made his most dangerous calculation yet. He realized that the Aztecs' greatest strength, their centralized authority, was also their greatest vulnerability. If Moctezuma could be neutralized, the entire system might freeze. The Spaniards were not planning to defeat the Aztec army. They were planning to decapitate the empire. At this stage, nothing was lost yet. The Aztecs still held overwhelming numbers, terrain control, and logistical superiority. But the war had already shifted from the battlefield to the mind of one man, and when warfare becomes psychological, numbers matter far less than hesitation. Inside Tenochtitlan, the illusion of control began to crack. From the outside, the city appeared unassailable. Stone causeways slicing through water, canals feeding markets, temples rising above the lake like mountains built by men. It was the political and spiritual heart of the empire, designed to project permanence. But permanence depends on certainty, and certainty was evaporating. The Spaniards were lodged inside the city, quartered under guard yet treated as honored guests. They walked the streets freely. They observed patrol routes. They counted warriors. They studied causeways, bridges, and choke points. Every day they survived inside the city was a day the empire failed to act decisively. This created a new kind of pressure, one the Aztec system was poorly equipped to handle. The military hierarchy waited for orders. The priesthood debated omens. Noble houses watched each other for signs of weakness. Meanwhile, Cortés watched all of them. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The Aztec leadership was not unified. Many nobles believed the Spaniards should be destroyed immediately. Others feared that killing foreign emissaries, who claimed to represent a distant emperor, could trigger unknown consequences. Subject states, long resentful of Aztec tribute demands, watched silently from the margins, calculating whether rebellion was finally possible. The empire was strong, but politically brittle. Moctezuma stood at the center of this tension. Every report, every rumor, every omen passed through him, and each piece of information contradicted the last. The Spaniards did not behave like defeated men. They did not behave like desperate invaders. They behaved like observers. That unsettled the court. As days passed, Cortés began to push boundaries. Spanish soldiers tested guards with casual defiance. They demanded access to temples. They asked pointed questions about leadership, alliances, and tribute flows. These were not random provocations. They were stress tests. Each time the Aztecs failed to respond decisively, the Spaniards learned something critical. Authority was fragile. Then came the spark. Spanish intelligence, filtered through interpreters and allies, reported that an Aztec commander on the coast had attacked and killed several Spaniards. Whether this was true or exaggerated barely mattered. Cortés seized the narrative instantly. He accused Moctezuma of betrayal. In any other context, this accusation would have been absurd. 600 foreigners, accusing the ruler of millions, should have ended in immediate execution. Instead, Moctezuma hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Cortés made his move. Under the pretense of securing safety, Spanish soldiers entered the palace and took the emperor hostage, without a battle, without bloodshed, without resistance. The heart of the empire was captured by a handful of men, not because they were stronger, but because no one believed they would dare. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Aztec commanders froze. Orders stopped flowing. Warriors waited for instructions that never came. The system designed for centralized command stalled completely. Moctezuma, now a prisoner in his own palace, attempted to maintain order by cooperation. He issued commands on Spanish behalf, believing compliance would prevent catastrophe, but compliance achieved the opposite. To the people of Tenochtitlan, their emperor now spoke with a foreign voice. Legitimacy evaporated. Here's the brutal arithmetic of the moment. The Aztecs still had overwhelming numbers. They still controlled the terrain. They could still annihilate the Spaniards in hours. But to act required coordination. Coordination required authority, and authority had been compromised at the top. Cortés understood this perfectly. He did not rush to destroy the Aztecs. He waited. He let tension ferment. He allowed resentment to grow. He forced the empire to exist in a state of suspended crisis, where every delay deepened internal fractures. Eventually, the city erupted. Crowds turned hostile. Stones flew. Warriors prepared for revolt, not against the Spaniards alone, but against the paralysis gripping their leadership. The empire had reached the breaking point, and all of it traced back to a single decision: hesitation instead of annihilation. The Aztecs had allowed a numerically insignificant enemy to enter the core of their power structure. They had mistaken restraint for control, and in warfare, restraint without dominance is indistinguishable from surrender. The illusion finally shattered inside Tenochtitlan. What began as murmurs turned into anger. What turned into anger hardened into resolve. The people could tolerate uncertainty, but they could not tolerate a ruler who appeared to speak under foreign command. Crowds gathered. Priests warned that the gods were displeased. Warriors demanded action. And suddenly, the balance flipped. Stones were thrown at Spanish patrols. Supply lines tightened. The once policed calm inside the city evaporated into open hostility. The Spaniards were still alive, but they were no longer invisible. This was the moment when numbers should have decided everything. The Aztecs controlled the city. They controlled the causeways. They controlled the water, the bridges, the food. The Spaniards were trapped. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Cortés had anticipated this outcome. He knew that once violence erupted, the Aztecs would revert to familiar patterns of warfare, patterns designed for capture, intimidation, and ritual victory. They would surround, isolate, exhaust, and overwhelm. So he prepared his men not to survive a siege, but to break contact violently and escape. When the uprising reached critical mass, the Spaniards struck first. They fortified their position around the palace, turning corridors into kill zones. Arquebuses thundered at close range. Crossbows fired into dense crowds. Steel blades hacked through cotton armor that was never designed to stop sustained thrusts. The Aztecs surged forward anyway. This was not fearlessness. It was doctrine. They expected the invaders to falter under pressure. They expected retreat, panic, or negotiation. Instead, they met controlled violence, short bursts of destruction aimed at creating shock rather than annihilation. The city descended into chaos. Smoke filled courtyards. Shouts echoed off stone walls. Drums beat from temples as calls to arms spread across districts. The empire finally moved, but it moved late and without cohesion. Cortés made a decision that bordered on suicidal. He ordered a breakout. The Spaniards would abandon the city at night, cross the causeways under fire, and attempt to reach Allied territory beyond the lake. It was madness on paper. The causeways were narrow. Bridges could be removed. Canoes could swarm from both sides. Tens of thousands of warriors waited in darkness. But Cortés understood one thing. Aztec warfare prized spectacle and capture. Night fighting, rapid movement, and refusal to stand and engage undermined their strengths. The breakout began under cover of darkness. Rain fell. Visibility dropped. Spanish columns moved fast, burdened by armor, weapons, and fatally gold looted during their stay. As they crossed the causeways, Aztec forces attacked from both sides. The night exploded into violence. War cries echoed across the lake. Canoes rammed into marching columns. Warriors dragged men into the water. Bridges collapsed. Horses screamed as they slipped into canals. This should have been total destruction. Instead, it became fragmentation. Aztec units attacked independently, focusing on individual capture rather than coordinated annihilation. Spanish rear guards fought desperate holding actions, using gunfire and cavalry charges in confined spaces, tactics that maximized shock at minimal cost. By dawn, the lake was littered with bodies, weapons, and treasure. The Spaniards had suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds were dead. Nearly all the gold was gone. The escape was not a victory, but it was not annihilation, and that mattered more than anything. The Aztecs had failed to finish the war when they had the chance. The surviving Spaniards regrouped outside the city, bloodied but alive. They retreated to allied territories, where resentment against Aztec rule burned hot. News of the uprising and the emperor's captivity spread rapidly. The empire had revealed its vulnerability to everyone watching. From this point on, the war changed shape. It was no longer 600 men against millions. It became a coalition war, one fueled by vengeance, betrayal, and the collapse of centralized authority. The Aztecs had won the city, but they had lost initiative, unity, and time. And in warfare, losing time against an adaptive enemy is often worse than losing a battle. When the dust settled outside Tenochtitlan, no one could honestly call what happened a Spanish victory. It was a survival. Hundreds of Spaniards were dead. Nearly all the gold they had gathered was gone. Lost in the lake, ripped from drowning men, scattered along the causeways. Horses lay bloated in the water. Veterans who had crossed oceans never rose again, but the Aztec Empire had failed to do the one thing that mattered most. It had failed to finish the enemy. The numbers tell the story clearly. The Aztecs had inflicted massive casualties. They had forced the invaders out of their sacred capital. They had reclaimed their city through sheer force of will and numbers. And yet, Hernán Cortés was still alive. His command structure still existed. His alliances still held. That meant the war was not over. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The escape from Tenochtitlan did more damage to the Aztec political system than the Spanish invasion ever had. Word spread fast. Subject city-states heard that the emperor had been captured, that he had spoken under foreign control, that the gods had not intervened decisively, that the invaders, though wounded, had escaped punishment. For peoples forced to pay tribute for generations, this was not just news. It was an invitation. Cortés retreated eastward into territories already hostile to Aztec rule. There, he found something more valuable than gold: manpower. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, Tlaxcalans and others, joined him not out of loyalty, but revenge. The arithmetic of war shifted. What had once been 600 Spaniards against an empire became a coalition force, moving with Spanish command structure, steel weapons, cavalry shock, and local knowledge. Meanwhile, inside Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs faced a crisis of legitimacy. Moctezuma was dead. Whether killed by his own people or struck during chaos mattered less than the symbolism. The divine center of the empire had fallen, not in battle, but in confusion. Leadership passed to successors who inherited an impossible situation. The city was restless, the countryside was unstable, allies were unreliable, and then came the invisible enemy. Disease. Smallpox entered the valley through contact with the Spaniards. It spread faster than any army, ripping through populations with no immunity. Warriors fell sick. Leaders died. Entire districts were incapacitated. The empire that had survived conquest for generations was now bleeding internally. When Cortés returned months later, he did not come as a guest. He came as a besieger. The Spaniards rebuilt brigantines to control the lake. They cut causeways deliberately. They isolated districts systematically. This time, there would be no hesitation, no negotiation, no symbolic restraint. The Aztecs fought ferociously, but the war had changed. Their enemies were no longer a strange, tiny force to be observed and interpreted. They were now a coalition that mirrored Aztec methods: siege, starvation, and psychological pressure, without sharing their limitations. By the time Tenochtitlan finally fell, the cost was staggering. The city was destroyed, its population decimated, its political system erased. The Spaniards paid dearly as well, but they paid a price they were prepared to endure. This is the cruel logic of the butcher's bill. Victory does not go to the side that loses fewer men in a single battle. It goes to the side that forces the enemy to pay repeatedly, over time, until collapse becomes inevitable. The Aztecs had multiple chances to end the war early: when the Spaniards first entered the city, when they hesitated to strike, when they allowed leadership to be compromised. Each delay compounded the cost. By the end, the empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it waited too long to act with finality. and history is unforgiving to those who hesitate when decisive force is required. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of a pattern. What happened in central Mexico would echo across centuries of conquest, not because it was unique, but because it revealed a rule that applies to every centralized power structure. Empires rarely fall at the moment of maximum threat. They fall at the moment of maximum hesitation. Militarily, the conquest rewrote assumptions about scale. The Aztecs possessed numbers, logistics, terrain, and cultural cohesion. By traditional arithmetic, they should have crushed the invaders instantly. Instead, they allowed a small, adaptable force to penetrate their command structure, disrupt legitimacy, and fracture unity from the inside. Modern military academies would later study this pattern, not as a triumph of bravery, but as a lesson in initiative. Centralized systems excel when authority is uncontested. They collapse when leadership becomes ambiguous. The Aztec Empire depended on clear command flowing from the top. When that command was compromised, the entire machine stalled. This is why the decisive moment was not a battle. It was the decision to delay annihilation. Psychologically, the conquest exposed how belief systems can become liabilities under stress. The Aztec worldview integrated war, religion, and politics into a single framework. That framework worked brilliantly against familiar enemies who understood its rules. It failed against an enemy who did not play by them. The Spaniards did not seek ritual dominance. They did not seek submission. They sought control of decision-making. Once leadership credibility was damaged, fear spread faster than armies ever could. Subject peoples defected not because they loved the Spaniards, but because they sensed that Aztec inevitability was gone. Disease accelerated what hesitation began, but disease alone does not topple empires. Political fragmentation does. Psychological collapse does. Loss of legitimacy does. This is the uncomfortable truth history often avoids. The Aztecs did not lose because they were inferior. They lost because they were uncertain. From a strategic perspective, this episode illustrates why early, decisive action matters more than overwhelming strength applied late. Every moment the Spaniards remained alive inside Tenochtitlan increased their leverage. Every day without annihilation multiplied risk. When leaders hesitate in moments that demand clarity, they unintentionally hand initiative to the enemy. The lesson is not ancient. It is universal. Centralized powers, whether empires, institutions, or organizations, depend on decisive authority. When that authority falters, even briefly, smaller forces can exploit the gap with disproportionate effect. Think about what this means. 600 men did not defeat 15 million through strength alone. They exploited delay, division, and doubt. They understood that wars are not won only by killing enemies, but by forcing systems to stop functioning. That single error, the choice to hesitate instead of act, transformed an empire's greatest strength into its fatal weakness. History remembers the fall of Tenochtitlan as inevitable. It was not. It was the result of decisions made under pressure, shaped by belief, fear, and uncertainty. And that is why this story still matters. Because in every age, power rests not in numbers alone, but in the willingness to act decisively when the moment demands it. Sometimes, the greatest victories are born not from overwhelming force, but from the moment when an empire waits, and waits just a little too long.